Snow fell hard over Denver that night, the kind of snow that swallowed sound and turned streetlights into soft halos. Charlotte Vance sat by the window of a small downtown cafe, checking her watch for the fourth time in 10 minutes. Her red coat was buttoned to the throat. Her coffee had gone cold, and the man she was supposed to meet was already 40 minutes late. In her world, people were never late. Not her clients, not her assistants, not the contractors who lined up outside her office every Monday morning hoping she'd list their buildings. Charlotte had built her name brokering the priciest properties in the city, and she had done it by never wasting a single minute of anyone's time, especially her own. She reached for her purse, ready to leave, when something made her pause. Maybe it was the snow drifting past the window like it had nowhere else to be. Maybe it was the ache of another Christmas Eve spent alone. Whatever it was, she set her purse back down and told herself, 5 more minutes. That single decision was about to change everything she thought she knew about her life. Hey everyone, welcome back to Winter Veil, the channel where we tell stories about love, second chances, and the kind of kindness that comes back around when you least expect it. If stories like this warm you up on a cold night, hit subscribe and drop a like before we start. It truly helps us keep going. Now let's get into tonight's story. I've always found winter strange like that, so quiet on the outside and so loud on the inside. There's something about the first real snowfall that makes people slow down and actually look at each other. For Charlotte, that snowfall was about to knock on a door she didn't know was closed. Let's see where it takes her. Charlotte hadn't wanted to come tonight at all. Her best friend, Paige, had been pushing this blind date for 3 straight weeks, ever since Charlotte had shown up to Paige's birthday dinner alone for the second year running. He's not rich, Char, Paige had warned her over the phone, laughing. But he's the kindest man I've ever met, and honestly, I think kindness is exactly what's missing from your life right now. Charlotte had almost said no outright. Her last 3 dates had all gone the same way. Expensive dinners where the men across the table spent more time talking about her portfolio than her life, as though Vance Realty Group were the only interesting thing about her. She'd stopped expecting anything different a long time ago, and some nights she wondered if she'd simply forgotten how to be anything other than efficient. Paige, are you sure about this one? Charlotte had asked, twirling a pen between her fingers at her desk while snow gathered on the 17th floor window behind her. He works 2 jobs and raises a little girl alone, Paige had said simply. He's not going to impress you with a watch, Char. He might just impress you by showing up honest. Something about that had stuck with Charlotte long after she'd hung up the phone. Charlotte hadn't argued. She was 32, she ran a brokerage with her name on the door, and she still went home most nights to an apartment that felt more like a hotel room than a life. So she'd agreed to 1 coffee. Café Bellwood, 7 o'clock, Christmas Eve. Simple, no pressure. Except now it was nearly 8, and the barista was already flipping the chairs onto the tables around her. A few miles across town, Ben Foster had spent the day exactly the way he spent most days, hauling pallets at the warehouse until his shoulders burned, then racing home through slush-covered streets to relieve the neighbor watching Ellie so he could shower and change in 11 minutes flat. He'd almost canceled the date twice that afternoon, telling himself a man with 2 jobs and a 5-year-old had no business showing up anywhere on time, let alone impressing anyone worth impressing. Only Ellie, oddly enough, had talked him into going. "You should go, Daddy," she'd said, solemnly handing him his good shirt from the closet. "Mommy would want you to have hot chocolate with someone nice." He'd made it 3 blocks from the bus stop when his phone rang, the babysitter's number flashing across the cracked screen, and his stomach had dropped straight through the icy sidewalk. By the time he'd sorted out a neighbor to cover the last hour and caught a second bus that promptly broke down on Colfax, he was already 40 minutes behind schedule and half convinced the whole night was a mistake he'd apologize his way out of by text message instead. She was halfway into her coat when the door burst open with a sharp jingle of bells. A gust of freezing wind rushed in, carrying a swirl of snowflakes with it, and a man stumbled through the entrance like he'd sprinted the last 3 blocks. "I am so sorry," he said, still catching his breath, one hand braced on the doorframe. "The bus broke down on Colfax, and then my sitter called and canceled 20 minutes before I had to leave." Charlotte blinked at him. This was Ben, and he looked nothing like the men she usually met for coffee. His coat was a faded navy thing with a torn seam at the shoulder. His boots were scuffed from what looked like years of hard use, and his hands, when he pulled off his gloves, were rough and calloused in a way that told her exactly how he made his living. But his eyes were a warm, steady blue, and somehow that mattered more than anything else in the room. "It's okay," she said, surprising herself by meaning it. "Sit down, you made it." For the next hour, they talked while an old Christmas playlist hummed through the cafe speakers. Ben didn't try to dress himself up or pretend to be someone he wasn't, and there was something disarming about that, something Charlotte wasn't used to from the men in her usual circles. He told her he'd lost his wife 3 years earlier, cancer, fast and cruel, and that he'd been raising their daughter alone ever since. During the day, he worked forklifts at a distribution warehouse on the edge of town, and most nights he picked up deliveries for a courier app just to keep the lights on. "It's a lot," he admitted, rubbing the back of his neck, "but Ellie's worth every double shift." His whole face changed when he talked about his daughter. "Christmas is her favorite thing in the whole world," he said, laughing a little. "We've got this tiny plastic tree from the thrift store, missing half its branches, and she calls it her magic tree like it's got some kind of power." Something in Charlotte's chest pulled tight when he said that. She couldn't remember the last Christmas that had felt magical to her instead of just another string of client dinners and expensive, empty gifts. "What about you?" Ben asked, turning the question back on her for the first time all evening. "Most people don't ask," Charlotte admitted, surprised by her own honesty. "They usually just want to know how many properties I closed last quarter." Ben smiled, unbothered. "I don't know what a quarter is in real estate terms," he said, "but I'd rather know what makes you happy outside of it, if anything does." Charlotte opened her mouth to give her usual answer, something polished about ambition and growth, and found she couldn't quite make herself say it. "Honestly," she admitted slowly, "I'm not sure anymore. I used to think building something big enough would be its own kind of happiness. Lately, it just feels like a very nice, very empty office." Ben didn't try to fix that for her. He just nodded like he understood exactly what she meant, and somehow that was more comforting than any reassurance could have been. Outside the window, snow kept falling in long, unhurried curtains, softening every hard edge of the city into something gentler. Ben watched it for a moment before speaking again. "My wife used to say snow was the world's way of asking everyone to slow down at the same time," he said quietly. "I didn't believe her back then. I was always too busy. I believe her more every year since." By the time the cafe lights dimmed for closing, neither of them had noticed the hours passing. Outside, the snow was still falling in slow, heavy sheets, dusting the shoulders of Ben's old coat as they stood on the sidewalk. "I almost didn't come tonight," he admitted quietly, looking almost embarrassed. "I figured someone like you wouldn't wait around for someone like me." Charlotte looked at him for a long moment, snow catching in her hair, and felt something loosen in her chest that had been locked tight for years. "I'm really glad I did," she said, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she actually meant every word of it. They said good night under the street lamp, and Charlotte watched him walk off into the snow until he turned the corner and disappeared. Christmas morning came wrapped in a soft blanket of fresh snow, the kind that made the whole city look brand new. But Charlotte couldn't stop thinking about Ben, about the little girl who believed a broken thrift store tree held magic. So she did something she hadn't done in years, something purely, quietly kind, with no angle and no deal attached to it. She went shopping. Toys, picture books, a warm little coat in bright red, and a small glowing star to sit on top of a certain plastic tree. She wrapped every single gift in gold paper by hand, something her assistant usually did for her, and tucked in a note that read simply, "For Ellie's magic tree, from someone who still believes in kindness." Using the address Ben had texted her the night before, she left everything outside his apartment door and drove away before he ever saw her car. That afternoon, Ben came home from a warehouse shift so tired his shoulders ached, only to have Ellie fling the door open, screaming with delight. "Daddy, Santa really came." Ben froze on the doorstep at the sight of the gold-wrapped box, and when he read Charlotte's note, his eyes stung with tears he didn't bother wiping away. He looked out over the quiet, snow-covered street and whispered her name like a small prayer of thanks. That night, watching Ellie dance around their little tree in her new red coat, Ben felt something he hadn't let himself feel in 3 long years. Hope, small and stubborn, refusing to be talked out of existing. He didn't know yet how much that single night of kindness was about to reshape both of their lives, or how close it would come to being taken away from them entirely. Weeks passed, and Charlotte buried herself back in work, the way she always did. She ran Vance Realty Group out of a glass office on the 17th floor, and every January brought a fresh wave of year-end closings that ate her calendar alive. But some nights, driving home past Café Bellwood, she found herself slowing down without meaning to, remembering a man in a torn coat who had looked at her like she was more than a name on a building. Then, on a gray Tuesday morning in late January, her boss, Richard Colton, called her into his office with a file already spread across his desk. "We just landed the Maple Hollow account," he said, sliding a folder toward her with a satisfied smile. "Sloan Properties wants to move fast, full acquisition, and they've asked for you personally to run the deal." Charlotte flipped open the folder, scanning the address out of habit more than curiosity, and felt her stomach drop straight through the floor. Maple Hollow Apartments. Ben's address. The same building where a little girl believed in a plastic Christmas tree, and where, according to the file in front of her, a man named Victor Sloan intended to clear every tenant out within 8 weeks to gut the building for luxury condos. She kept her face perfectly still, the way 10 years of negotiating had trained her to, while her mind raced through every version of Ben's apartment number she had ever typed into her phone. Richard didn't notice a thing. "This is a big one, Charlotte," he said, tapping the folder. "Sloan's paying premium commission if we clear the building by spring. Don't let the tenants slow you down. They always try guilt first." Charlotte drove straight to Maple Hollow that evening instead of going home. She told herself it was professional due diligence, walking the property before drafting relocation notices, but really she just needed to see the building with her own eyes. The cracked front steps dusted in fresh snow, the crooked mailbox row, the flickering porch light over Unit 4B. Ben's building. Ben's home. Ben's daughter's magic tree, somewhere behind one of those dark windows. She found Ben in the parking lot, scraping ice off his old truck's windshield before a late shift, and the surprise on his face when he saw her nearly broke something loose in her chest. "Charlotte," he said, breaking into a grin before he even fully processed she was standing there. "I didn't think I'd ever see you again after that night, honestly. I wasn't sure you were real." "I'm real," she said, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Can we talk for a minute?" She told him the truth right there in the cold, every bit of it. Her firm's involvement, Sloan's plans, the 8-week timeline sitting in a folder on her desk. Ben's face went pale under the porch light. 8 weeks, he repeated slowly. "Charlotte, Ellie starts kindergarten here in the fall. Mrs. Alders next door has lived in this building for 31 years. She doesn't have anywhere else to go." Charlotte spent that whole night awake, staring at her apartment ceiling, running numbers and clauses through her head like a defense attorney building a case with no client yet. In the morning, she went to Richard with an idea, a phased relocation plan, extended timelines, hardship exemptions for elderly tenants like Dorothy Alders. Richard barely let her finish the sentence. "Sloan wants it cleared by spring, full stop," he said. "That's the account. Don't complicate it." She tried anyway, quietly, working the edges of the deal, slowing paperwork by a week here, a week there, flagging code violations in the building that would legally require Sloan to delay demolition permits. It bought Ben and the other tenants time, but it didn't go unnoticed for long. Victor Sloan himself showed up at the office in early February, sharp suit, sharper voice, demanding to know why his acquisition had stalled in the county filing office for 3 straight weeks. He stopped by Charlotte's desk on his way out, close enough that she caught the expensive, sharp scent of his cologne and studied her nameplate like he was memorizing it for later use. "You're the broker holding up my permits," he said, not quite a question, his tone pleasant in a way that felt more threatening than shouting would have. "I looked into your file, Ms. Vance. Very impressive numbers over the years. It would be a shame to watch a career like yours stall out over a few sentimental tenants who'll find somewhere else to live regardless of what either of us does." Charlotte held his gaze evenly. "Those sentimental tenants have names, Mr. Sloan," she said. "One of them has lived in that building longer than I've been alive." Sloan smiled thinly, the kind of smile that never reached his eyes. "Names don't stop wrecking crews, Ms. Vance," he said, straightening his cuff. "Neither does sympathy, in my experience. I'd suggest you decide quickly whose side of this desk you actually want to be sitting on." He left without waiting for an answer. and Charlotte sat frozen at her desk long after the elevator doors closed behind him, snow ticking softly against the 17th floor windows like the whole city was holding its breath along with her. Richard called Charlotte in immediately, his jaw tight with barely contained anger. "Sloan says someone's been sandbagging his permits," he said, staring her down across his desk. "Tell me it isn't you." Charlotte held his gaze without blinking, feeling the ground shift under her career for the first time in 10 years. "I know some of those tenants," she admitted. "I don't think it's right to get a building full of families 2 months before spring with nowhere lined up for them to go." Richard's expression hardened into something Charlotte had never seen from him before. "This isn't a charity, Charlotte," he said flatly. "It's a business, and Sloan is worth more to this firm than every tenant in that building combined. If you can't close this the way he wants it closed, I'll find someone who can, and your name comes off every listing we've built together." The threat landed exactly where he meant it to. That same week, Charlotte met Paige for lunch, mostly because she needed to say the truth out loud to someone who wasn't Richard or Ben. "I might lose my job over a building full of strangers," she admitted, pushing salad around her plate without eating any of it. Paige set down her fork and studied her for a long moment. "Char," she said gently, "in 10 years of knowing you, I have never once heard you care about anything you couldn't put a price tag on. Whatever this is, I think it's the first honest thing you've done in this whole career." Charlotte laughed despite herself, eyes stinging unexpectedly. "It doesn't feel very honest," she said. "It feels terrifying." Paige reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "Most of the right things do, at first," she said. "That's usually how you know they're the right things." Charlotte held on to that conversation for weeks afterward, replaying it in her head every time Richard's office door loomed a little too large at the end of the hallway. That weekend, Ben invited her to Ellie's preschool Christmas in February pageant, a silly little tradition the school ran every year to make up for missing the real thing during winter break. Charlotte almost canceled twice, terrified of facing Ben knowing what she knew, but she went anyway and found him sitting in the back row with an old camera, saving her a seat like it was the easiest thing in the world. Ellie spotted her the second she walked in and waved so hard she nearly fell off her folding chair. After the little pageant, the girl ran straight into Charlotte's arms, chattering about her paper snowflake costume, and Charlotte held her tightly, feeling the weight of the folder on her desk pressing harder against her chest with every second. Ben caught her eyes over Ellie's head, something quietly grateful and completely unaware in his expression. She almost told him everything right there in the school gymnasium. Instead, she waited until Ellie ran off to find her friends, then pulled Ben aside near the coat racks. "There's something you need to know," she said, and told him the rest: Sloane's threats, Richard's ultimatum, her own job hanging by a thread. Ben went very still, jaw tight, and for a long moment he didn't say anything at all. "You could lose everything you've built trying to help us," he said finally, and it wasn't quite a question. Charlotte shook her head slowly. "I think I've already lost something a lot more important if I don't," she said. Ben studied her for a long moment, snow drifting past the gymnasium windows behind him, then reached out and took her hand like he was making a decision he couldn't take back. "Then we fight it together," he said quietly. The next morning, Charlotte drove to the county records office before work and pulled the full inspection history on Maple Hollow herself, cross-referencing it against Sloane's submitted renovation plans. Buried in an old maintenance file from 6 years earlier, she found it. The building held a minor historic registry designation from a 1970s preservation grant, one that legally required a 90-day public review period before any structural demolition permit could be approved. It wasn't a loophole so much as a forgotten thread, but it was enough. Charlotte spent 3 sleepless nights building the case quietly, after hours, careful not to leave a trail back to her desk at the firm. She reached out to a tenants' rights attorney named Hannah Reyes. A friend from law school Paige had introduced her to years earlier, and together they filed an emergency review request the following Monday morning. Word reached Victor Sloan by Tuesday afternoon, and by Wednesday he was standing in Richard's office with the filing printed and clutched in his fist, demanding answers neither of them had. "Someone leaked this from inside your firm," Sloan snapped, slapping the paper down on the desk. "I want to know who, and I want them gone before this costs me another dollar in delays." Richard didn't need to guess twice. He called Charlotte in that same afternoon, his face a shade paler than usual, The ultimatum from weeks earlier apparently forgotten in favor of open fury. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" he said, voice low and furious. "Sloane's threatening to pull every account he's got with us. And it's because of some historic filing that conveniently surfaced right after you started dragging your feet on this deal. You knew about Maple Hollow before we ever took the account, didn't you?" Richard said, some of the fury draining into something closer to disbelief. "That's why you fought this from day one." Charlotte considered lying, then decided she was done doing that in this office. "I met someone who lives there," she said simply. "A single father, and his daughter, and an 83-year-old woman who's lived in that building longer than either of us has been alive. That doesn't change what's legally required before Sloane can knock down a single wall." Charlotte didn't flinch. "I found a legitimate designation that your team's due diligence missed," she said evenly. "If Sloane's plans can't survive 90 days of public review, that's not my failure, that's his." Richard stared at her like he was seeing a stranger. "You're choosing a warehouse worker in a building full of strangers over 10 years of your career," he said. "I hope it's worth it, because as of today, you're off the Maple Hollow account, and we'll be discussing whether you're off this firm entirely." Charlotte walked out of that meeting with her hands shaking, but her spine straight, and drove directly to Maple Hollow without stopping to think it through. She found Ben in the parking lot again, this time helping Dorothy Alders carry groceries up the icy front steps, and the sight of it, the two of them laughing quietly together in the falling snow, nearly undid her right there on the sidewalk. "I might have just ended my career for you," she told him, half laughing, half close to tears, and Ben set the grocery bags down slowly, studying her face like he was trying to memorize it. "You didn't do it for me," he said finally, quiet and sure. "You did it because it was right, and that's a very different thing, Charlotte. That's the thing I noticed about you the very first night, even before I knew your name." Dorothy Alders, 83 years old and sharp as a tack, patted Charlotte's arm on her way past with her grocery bags. "Whatever happens with that fancy job of yours," she said, 31 years I've lived in this building, and you're the first person from downtown who ever bothered to walk these steps and actually look at us." Charlotte's throat tightened, and for once in her adult life, she let someone see exactly how much that landed. The historic review bought 60 additional days, but it didn't kill the sale outright, and Sloane wasn't a man who gave up easily. He returned in March with an amended proposal, a partial renovation plan that technically satisfied the preservation requirements while still displacing most of the current tenants into units they couldn't remotely afford. Richard, eager to smooth things over with his angriest client, pushed it through the firm's approval committee within a single week. Ben called a tenants' meeting in the cramped little laundry room on the ground floor the night the amended proposal leaked. A dozen worried faces crowded between the washing machines under a single flickering bulb. Dorothy Alders sat closest to the door in her good coat, hands folded tightly in her lap. 31 years, she said quietly, to no one in particular. "I raised my son in this building. I buried my husband from this building. I don't know how to start over somewhere else at my age, and I don't much want to learn." Ben crouched beside her chair, one hand on her shoulder. "Nobody's starting over anywhere, Dorothy," he said, with more confidence than he actually felt. "Charlotte's still fighting this, even without her firm behind her anymore." A young mother near the dryers, holding a sleeping toddler against her shoulder, spoke up nervously. "What happens if she can't stop it, though?" she asked. "What happens to the rest of us then?" Nobody in the room had an answer, and the silence that followed felt heavier than the cold outside. That night, after Ellie had fallen asleep clutching her stuffed rabbit, Ben sat alone at the kitchen table with the amended proposal spread out in front of him, reading legal language he barely understood by the light of a single lamp. He thought about calling Charlotte, then didn't, not wanting to load one more worry onto a fight she was already risking everything for. Instead, he sat there until the coffee went cold, watching snow gather quietly against the windowsill, and let himself hope in the stubborn, exhausted way that had gotten him through the last 3 years. Charlotte heard about the vote secondhand, from a junior broker who still spoke to her in the hallways, and felt something cold and furious settle low in her stomach. She wasn't on the account anymore, wasn't even fully sure she still had a job by the end of the quarter, but she wasn't finished, not with Ben's name on a relocation letter, and not with Dorothy Alders' 31 years reduced to a line item in Sloane's spreadsheet. She spent the next week building something Richard never saw coming, a coalition of local investors interested in preserving Maple Hollow as affordable housing under the historic grant's original intent. People she'd built relationships with over a decade of deals that had nothing to do with gutting buildings for profit. Hannah Reyes drafted the legal framework overnight, and by the following Monday, Charlotte had an offer on the table that matched Sloane's price without displacing a single tenant. The night before the board meeting, Charlotte sat alone in her apartment rehearsing what she'd say. The offer papers spread across her kitchen table instead of a desk for the first time in years. She thought about calling Richard to try one last time, then thought better of it. She thought about calling Ben instead, just to hear his voice, but stopped herself halfway through dialing, not wanting him to carry the weight of a decision that was hers alone to make. Around midnight, she gave up on sleep entirely and stood by her window watching snow fall over the sleeping city, thinking about Dorothy Alder's 31 years, about Ellie's paper snowflake costume, about a version of herself from a year earlier who would have signed Sloane's deal without a second thought and called it a good quarter. That version of her felt like a stranger now, someone she recognized but no longer wanted to be, and somewhere in that quiet realization, she found the steadiness she needed for the morning. She brought it to the firm's board directly, bypassing Richard entirely, and stood in front of 8 partners in a conference room that suddenly felt very small. "I know I broke protocol," she said, voice steady despite the pounding in her chest. "But I have a fully financed offer that saves this firm the exact same commission without evicting 41 families 2 months before spring, and I think that's worth 5 minutes of your time regardless of what happens to me afterward." The room went quiet for a long moment, partners exchanging glances Charlotte couldn't quite read. Then the firm's senior founding partner, a soft-spoken woman named Helen Voss who rarely spoke in meetings at all, cleared her throat. "Richard," she said, turning slowly toward him, "remind me again why we're taking financial advice from a client who threatens to pull his account every time someone tells him no." The vote, when it came an hour later, went 8-1 against the original sale. Victor Sloane's business with the firm ended within the month, loudly and expensively, and Richard's grip on his own position loosened considerably in the fallout that followed. Charlotte kept her job, though the firm looked different to her after that, smaller somehow, and less like the only thing she'd ever built her worth around. She drove to Maple Hollow that same evening, snow just beginning to fall again, soft and unhurried, like the whole city was exhaling. Ben opened the door before she even knocked, like some part of him had been listening for her car in the parking lot all evening. "It's over," she told him, laughing and crying at the same time in a way she hadn't allowed herself in years. "Sloane's out. The building's safe. Dorothy gets to keep her 31 years. Ben pulled her inside without a word, into a hallway smelling faintly of pine and cheap heating, and just held on for a long moment like he was afraid the news might slip away if he let go too soon. Later, sitting at his small kitchen table while Ellie colored quietly at the counter behind them, Ben grew unusually serious, turning his coffee mug slowly between both hands. "I almost didn't call you after that pageant," he admitted. "Not because I didn't want to, but because I kept thinking, what happens when all this is over and you go back to your world and I go back to mine? And this was just a strange, kind thing you did for a stranger's kid one Christmas." Charlotte reached across the table and covered his rough hand with hers. "I don't want to go back to that world," she said quietly. "I spent 10 years thinking success meant never needing anyone. And then I met a man in a torn coat who showed me exactly how empty that felt." Ben looked up at her, something cautious and hopeful warring in his expression, snow ticking softly against the kitchen window behind him. Ellie, without looking up from her drawing, announced to no one in particular that Charlotte should come to their real Christmas next year, not the pretend February one. Ben laughed, startled, and Charlotte felt something in her chest finally unclench completely, some old cold place that had been frozen shut for years quietly beginning to thaw. "I would love that," she said, meaning it more than she'd meant almost anything in a decade. Spring came slowly to Denver that year, the way it always does, snow lingering stubbornly in the shadowed corners of Maple Hollow's courtyard long after the rest of the city had turned green. Charlotte found herself there most weekends now, helping Dorothy Alders with her garden boxes or sitting on Ben's fire escape with Ellie, teaching her to spot the first crocuses pushing up through the last patches of ice. In the weeks right after Sloane's deal collapsed, Charlotte almost pulled away from Maple Hollow entirely, though she never quite admitted that to Ben. Part of her worried that once the crisis passed, whatever had pulled them together would quietly dissolve along with it, and that she'd become just another complicated chapter in a hard year rather than someone he actually wanted to keep. She hesitated over her phone more than once before finally driving over uninvited on a gray Sunday afternoon, half convinced he'd be relieved for a reason to let her go gently. Ben opened the door and read the uncertainty on her face before she'd said a single word. "You look like you're about to tell me goodbye," he said quietly, not unkindly. Charlotte admitted it right there on the doorstep, the fear that she'd only mattered to him as long as there was a crisis to survive together. Ben was quiet for a moment, then reached out and took her hand, pulling her gently inside out of the cold. "I didn't fall for you because you saved my building, Charlotte," he said. "I fell for you the night you waited 40 minutes for a stranger in a torn coat, long before any of this started." That part was never about Maple Hollow. Richard never fully forgave her, and eventually she left Vance Realty on her own terms, starting something smaller with Hannah Reyes, a firm that specialized in exactly the kind of deals nobody else wanted to touch, the ones that protected people instead of displacing them. It paid less. Charlotte had never felt richer in her life. Summer came and went with barbecues in the Maple Hollow courtyard that Charlotte never used to know existed in her old life. And by fall she had learned the names of nearly every family in the building, not just Ben's. Dorothy Alders taught her how to can tomatoes from the little garden boxes out back, insisting it was a skill every modern woman had foolishly let go extinct. Ellie started kindergarten in September exactly where she'd hoped to, in the same building, on the same street, with the same crooked mailbox row out front. By December, almost a full year after that first snowy night at Café Bellwood, the little cafe glowed again with string lights and quiet holiday music. At a corner table sat Ben, nervously smoothing down a new jacket Ellie had picked out for him herself, while Ellie sipped hot chocolate beside him, swinging her legs under the table. Then the door jingled open, and Charlotte stepped in out of the snow, wearing the same red coat from the year before. "She's here," Ellie shouted, loud enough to turn heads at the next table, and Charlotte laughed, crossing the room to scoop the little girl into a hug before she'd even taken off her gloves. "Traffic okay this time?" Charlotte teased, settling into the seat beside Ben. He chuckled, low and warm. "Caught the early bus on purpose," he admitted, "just in case." They spent the evening talking and laughing over cheap coffee that tasted better than anything Charlotte had ordered in a boardroom in years, the kind of warmth no amount of money had ever been able to buy her. Outside, snow drifted down slow and steady over the sidewalk where they'd first stood together, exactly 1 year earlier. Charlotte reached across the table and brushed her fingers against Ben's rough hand. "Do you ever think about how one small decision changes absolutely everything?" she asked quietly. Ben nodded, turning his hand over to hold hers properly. "Every single day," he said. "You waited for me that night when you didn't have to, and because of it, my daughter still has a home, and I got a second chance I never thought I deserved." Charlotte's eyes shone under the string lights. "Maybe we both got a second chance," she said softly. And there, in the same cafe where it had all begun, two people who had almost missed each other found something worth keeping. Later that night, walking Ben and Ellie back toward the bus stop through softly falling snow, Charlotte found herself thinking about the version of this same night 1 year earlier, the version where she'd almost left the cafe 5 minutes too soon. It astonished her sometimes how the whole shape of a life could pivot on something as small as staying seated a little longer than she wanted to. Charlotte learned that year that success built on other people's losses was never really success at all. Ben learned that even in his hardest, most exhausted years, kindness could still find its way to his door in the shape of a stranger who refused to leave. And Ellie, small as she was, learned the simplest truth of all, that sometimes the people who save you don't wear capes or carry titles. They just refuse to give up on you when it would be easier to walk away. So if this winter has you feeling impatient or tired or ready to give up on someone who's worth waiting for, remember Charlotte standing in that cafe doorway, 5 more minutes turning into a lifetime. Kindness doesn't always announce itself loudly, but it changes everything it touches. Thank you for spending this evening with us here on Winter Vale. If this story found its way into your heart tonight, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the next one. Drop a like, and tell us in the comments which moment moved you the most. We'll be back soon with another story about the quiet kind of miracles that happen in the coldest months of the year. Stay warm, stay kind, and we'll see you next time.